In August of 2017, a check for $187,450 sat on a kitchen table in the North Carolina foothills, and the man who had earned it did not say a single word about it. He sat across from his grandson and looked at the number the way he looked at most things, with the patience of someone who had already done the arithmetic in his head long before anyone else thought to run it. Corbett had called him in from the property to look at the screen, and Leland had come in, wiped his hands on his work pants, and read the figure twice without changing his expression. Then he looked out the window at the western fence line and was quiet for a long time. That check was not an inheritance. It was not a settlement or a lottery or a gift from any person living or dead. It was the annual net revenue of a business built entirely on something a local brewery had considered garbage for 14 years. And to understand how it came to exist, you have to go back to May of 2003, to a gravel lane in the red clay country north of town, and to a man standing at a gate with a piece of wire he had been carrying in his pocket for the better part of a decade. Leland Vance was 62 years old that spring. He had been born on the same 88 acres his great-grandfather had purchased in 1889 for $1,100, a parcel of rolling ground in the foothills where the soil ran red and stubborn and did not give much without being asked carefully. He was known in the county for three things. He never discarded a piece of baling twine. His fence lines were always perfectly straight, measured by eye with an accuracy that confounded men who used instruments. And he believed with the conviction of someone who had tested the idea repeatedly across decades that the answer to most problems was already present on your land, if you were willing to be still long enough to see it. His daughter Wilda lived with her son Corbett 10 minutes down the road. Corbett was 15 that year, with his mother's practicality and a teenager's impatience with anything that could not be explained in a single clear sentence. Wilda loved her father without reservation and worried about him the same way because she understood that his stubbornness was not the brittle kind that breaks, but the deep kind that does not move, regardless of what pushes against it. She had stopped asking him when he planned to slow down. She had started asking instead why he was always starting something new. He kept a small notebook in the breast pocket of his work shirt. Not a ledger, not a journal. Just a pocket notebook, the kind sold at hardware stores for $2. He wrote in it throughout the day in a script so small that most people could not have read it without squinting. He would transfer the important entries to the large ledgers in his office each evening. But the pocket notebook was where the thinking happened, where observations got made before the mind had time to decide whether they were worth keeping. It was one of the small habits that distinguished him from nearly every other farmer in the county, and almost no one who knew him understood what it meant. The brewery had been operating since the late 90s out of a rented warehouse on the edge of town. Artisan Creek Brewing was the project of two friends who had met in college and spent their 20s talking about German lagers before finally doing something about it. By 2003, they had outgrown their original 7-barrel system and upgraded to a 30-barrel operation, which meant they were making more beer, and as a direct consequence, creating a new and persistent logistical problem. Birch Holloway, one of the two founders, was the one who handled the operational side of the business. His co-founder handled recipes and relationships. Birch handled everything else, including the growing problem of spent grain. The mashing process that converts malted barley into fermentable sugar leaves behind a substantial byproduct. The grain has been stripped of its starch, but retains high concentrations of protein and dietary fiber. And in its wet state, it has a warm, yeasty smell that is not unpleasant for the first few hours. After that, the microbial activity that was suppressed during brewing resumes with enthusiasm. Within 24 hours, the pile begins to sour. Within 48, it becomes genuinely foul. The local landfill charged $50 per ton in tipping fees. At 15 tons per week, that was $39,000 a year to dispose of something that had already served its purpose. Glenn had been working through various potential solutions when he remembered Leland Vance. His father had bought a Hereford bull from Leland's father 30 years earlier, which made Birch perhaps the third or fourth degree of connection in a county where most people could trace their relationships back 2 or 3 generations without difficulty. He drove his dusty Ford Ranger out the 4 miles of county road to the Vance farm on a Tuesday morning in May, and found Leland at the gate doing exactly what he was usually doing, which was tending to something with focused attention and no urgency whatsoever. Glenn explained the situation clearly: the grain, the volume, the cost, the timeline. He proposed a handshake arrangement. The brewery's flatbed truck would come to the farm every Monday and Thursday morning and deposit the week's production along the western fence line at a spot accessible from the road without needing to cross cultivated ground. The brewery would pay nothing for the disposal. Leland would pay nothing for the grain. 2 problems, 1 solution, no paperwork. Leland listened to all of it. When Birch finished, Leland looked out toward the western fence line. It was a 1/4-acre patch of ground where nothing useful had grown in years, overrun by broom sedge and the occasional volunteer cedar. He looked at it for what felt to Birch like an unusually long time. He was not thinking about his cattle. He ran a small herd on pasture, 12 head, and he knew before Birch finished explaining that the protein profile of wet, spent grain was not well suited for finishing steers. He was thinking about something else. He was thinking the way he always thought, which was slowly and from the soil upward. "That'll work," he said. Glenn drove back to town, satisfied. The following Monday, the first truck arrived and deposited a steaming, fragrant load of spent grain at the western fence line. Over the following weeks and months, the pile grew and changed and settled, and Leland watched it the way he watched most things on his property, with patience, with a pocket notebook, and without explaining himself to anyone. For the first 3 months, he did nothing with the pile beyond observe it. He watched how it behaved in rain, how the surface dried to a crust in summer heat, how the deer came at night and nibbled at the edges. He noticed the insects that appeared in the outer layers and the ones that worked deeper in. One morning in late September, he took a shovelful from 6 inches below the surface and mixed it with a measure of red clay and set it in a small wooden flat on the workbench in his equipment shed, checking it every few days the way a man checks a seed he has planted. Corbett came to visit on a Saturday in early October, and when he walked past the western fence line, he stopped and looked at the pile with the expression that 15-year-olds reserve for things adults have done that make no visible sense. He found his grandfather in the equipment shed. "Papow," he said, "that stuff stinks. Why don't you just get some bags of pellets from the co-op?" Leland set down what he was holding and looked at the boy. He did not answer the question directly. He said, "Do you know why the soil in the northeast corner of the backfield is lighter than the rest?" Corbett did not know. "That's something I haven't taught you yet," Leland said. And then he picked up his work again. It was not a dismissal. For Leland, it was the entire answer. The pellets at the co-op were a solution to a different problem than the one he was working on. What he was building required something that could not be purchased and delivered in bags. He had not yet decided what that something was, but he knew it involved the pile at the western fence, and he knew it would take time, and he knew that explaining it before he understood it himself would only produce an argument he did not yet have the evidence to win. In the second week of October, he drove his 1988 Chevrolet S10 East on Highway 24 through the Piedmont and into the flat coastal plain country of Sampson County, 350 miles round trip, and he came back with 4 pigs in a cage of wood and wire in the truck bed. He had paid $1,200 in cash, 3 gilts and 1 young boar. They were not the pink and white hogs that crowded the commercial operations a few counties over. Those operations ran on efficiency and uniformity on pounds per day, and feed conversion ratios on the industrial logic that everything on a farm was a number, and every number could be optimized. These 4 animals were something older and slower, and in the judgment of every industrial pork producer in the country, essentially useless. The Gloucestershire Old Spot was a heritage breed that had been in England for at least 2 centuries. It was sometimes called the orchard pig because of its history of foraging beneath apple trees, eating the windfall fruit that no one else wanted. The animals were white with large, irregular black spots, broad across the back with enormous, floppy ears that drooped forward and covered their eyes so completely that they navigated more by smell and sound than by sight. They were known for 3 things that made them prized in some quarters and ignored in most: a docile, curious temperament, exceptional marbling and depth of flavor in their meat, and a growth rate so slow that the industrial pork system had effectively abandoned the breed entirely. A commercial operation expected a market hog to reach 250 pounds in 5 to 6 months. An old spot might take 9 to 12 months to reach the same weight, sometimes longer. In a system designed around quarterly returns and throughput metrics, that kind of timeline was not a quirk to be accommodated. It was a disqualifying defect. Leland had known this when he drove to Sampson County. He had thought about it at some length before he left, and he had decided that a breed the industrial system had discarded for being too slow was exactly the kind of animal that fit the kind of system he was thinking about building. He fenced off 5 acres of mixed woodland on the eastern side of the property, hickory and oak and a few older persimmon trees, and built a 3-sided shelter from reclaimed lumber he had been keeping in the equipment shed for the better part of a decade. He put the 4 pigs in the fenced wood lot on a Thursday afternoon and spent the following morning studying how they moved through the space where they gravitated, how they used their snouts in the leaf litter beneath the oaks. On Friday evening, he drove the gator down to the western fence line, loaded the bed with approximately 300 pounds of spent grain from the pile, and drove it to the woodlot. He did not dump it in a single place. He scattered it across a wide area of the lot in small deposits, forcing the pigs to root and search rather than stand in one place and eat. He watched them for 20 minutes and wrote 3 lines in his pocket notebook before driving back to the barn. This was how the rhythm began. Every morning, grain from the fence line scattered through the trees. Every fall, acorns from the floor of the woodlot. The abandoned apple orchard a mile down the county road, which had been yielding fruit to no one in particular, since the family that planted it had sold the land 40 years earlier, became a twice-weekly stop in September and October. An arrangement with the produce market in town provided a steady supply of unsellable vegetables, soft squash and wilted greens and bruised tomatoes at no cost beyond a conversation and a handshake. Leland's daughter, Wilda, who ran his household finances on the same software she used for her own, once asked him to list the feed costs for his livestock operation. He told her the number was very close to 0. She thought he was joking. He was not. That December, Wilda came to dinner on a Friday evening and stayed after Corbett had gone upstairs to do homework. She sat at the kitchen table while her father recorded the week's entries in the large ledger by lamplight. She watched him write and thought about the question she had been carrying for months. "Daddy," she said, "what are you doing with these years?" He looked up. "Investing. In pigs. In the land. In what I know. In time." She looked at him across the table. "Corbett's not going to be here to see whatever you're building. And you might not be either." Leland was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who told you I was doing this for myself?" Wilda did not have an answer to that. She put on her coat and said goodnight, and drove home in the dark. And when Corbett asked her the next morning what Grandpa had said, she told him she still wasn't sure, which was the truth. The first litter arrived in the spring of 2004, 11 piglets born over 2 cold nights in March. Leland sat with the sow through both nights, checking in every few hours, keeping notes. He raised the surviving 9 to market weight through the summer and fall of that year, and on a gray November morning he loaded them into his trailer and drove them to the regional livestock auction. He had stopped for gas at the station on Route 16 about 3 miles from his property, and Amos Renfro was filling his truck at the adjacent pump. Amos ran 500 acres of tobacco and commodity corn. On the other side of the county had been farming his family's land for as long as Leland had been farming his, and was the kind of man who kept a running inventory of everyone else's agricultural choices without being asked. Pete looked at the trailer and at the spotted animals inside it, and said with the tone of a man who means well but cannot quite hide what he actually thinks, "Old spots, huh? Good luck with those." Said it the way you say something to a friend who has made a decision you consider unnecessary. Leland paid for his gas and said nothing. He drove to the auction. The auctioneer had known Leland for 30 years and greeted him at the gate with the easy familiarity of a man who expects no surprises. He walked along the rail of the pen and looked at the 9 hogs with practiced eyes, and then he looked at Leland with an expression that was professional and apologetic at the same time. "They're carrying a bit of extra cover," he said, meaning the layer of fat that ran beneath the skin and across the shoulders and loins was visible and substantial, substantially more than the lean commodity pork the market wanted. 58 cents a pound. It was an average price for an average hog on an average day. Not good. Not bad. Leland accepted it, watched the 9 hogs move through the ring, and went to collect his payment. Amos Renfro was in the crowd. He had dropped off a load of feeder calves and was standing with 2 other men Leland recognized from the co-op counter. And when the spotted hogs moved through the ring and the auctioneer called 58 cents, Amos said something to the men beside him, and all 3 of them laughed. The laugh was not cruel. It was the kind of laugh that carries a specific message, which was, this is what happens when a man does something the market has already decided it does not need. Leland did not look at them. He did not adjust his expression. He walked to the window, collected his check, shook the auctioneer's hand, and found his truck in the lot. Corbett was sitting in the passenger seat. He had watched all of it. On the drive home, he sat without speaking for several minutes, and then he said, "Why didn't you say anything to Mr. Renfro? What would I have said?" "I don't know." "Something. When you have enough evidence," Leland said, "you don't need to say anything at all. The problem is, today we don't have enough yet." Corbett thought about this. He was 15 years old, and the distinction between having evidence and not having it was still primarily a legal concept, not a philosophical one. He did not fully understand what his grandfather meant. But he understood that the old man had not been embarrassed by what happened at the ring, only patient in the way that Leland Vance was patient about everything, which was with the settled certainty of a man who has already calculated the outcome and is simply waiting for the calendar to catch up. He pulled into the lane and parked by the barn and got out and went to his office and opened the ledger and wrote down 58 cents per pound next to the date and the total weight and the check number and the buyer's name. Then he wrote down the cost of gas for the round trip. Then he closed the ledger and went to check on the remaining sow, who had come through the fall in excellent condition and would cycle back into breeding before winter was out. The pile at the western fence line had been there for 14 months. It had changed in ways that were visible to anyone who spent time near it, and invisible to anyone who did not. The color of the upper layer had shifted from the pale gold of fresh grain to a dark brown that was closer to earth than to food. Beneath the surface, the temperature was measurably different from the surrounding soil. And in the weeks following a heavy rain, if you crouched at the edge of the pile and looked carefully at the material that had washed to the margins, you could see things moving in the darkness that had not been there the year before. Leland had noted all of this. He had begun to understand the pile not as a waste product, but as a resource in process, something in a long, slow transformation toward a different kind of usefulness. It fit the way he understood most things on his land, which was as systems with their own timelines indifferent to human impatience, reliable in the long run if you knew how to read them. The 4 original animals were entering their second year. The guilt he had held back from the first litter was showing the calm disposition and attentive maternal instinct he had been selecting for. The old boar was steady. The woodland lot was doing what he had expected. Woodland lots to do when managed correctly, which was improved slowly in ways that compounded across years. He was not discouraged by the 58 cents. He had not gone to the auction expecting $40 a pound. He had gone to establish a baseline to learn the rhythm of the market at the low end and to begin accumulating the kind of specific documented history that a man needs when he is building something that no one else can see yet. The ledger was everything. Not the entries themselves, which were just numbers and dates, but the habit of keeping them, the discipline of recording what actually happened, rather than what you hoped or feared might happen. His father had kept ledgers. His grandfather had kept ledgers in a different hand in different books that still sat in the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk in the small office off the kitchen. The continuity of that practice was itself a kind of capital, a way of seeing across time that could not be acquired any other way. Outside, the pile at the western fence steamed faintly in the cold November air. The next truck would come on Monday, and the one after that on Thursday, and the one after that on the following Monday. For 1,456 more times, a truck from Artisan Creek Brewing would back up to that fence line and deposit its load, and Leland Vance would watch it and measure it and record it and use it to build something that had no name in any agricultural manual or business school curriculum anywhere in the country. He would not live to see all of it completed, but he understood that too, and it did not change anything about what he did the next morning or the morning after that or any morning that followed. By 2007, the ground at the western fence line had changed color. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in the way that real change happens on a farm, which is so slowly that you could miss it entirely if you were not paying attention. Leland had been paying attention. The soil in that quarter-acre strip, which had run the same pale clay red as everything else on the property for as long as he could remember, had begun to darken. Not in the upper crust that dried out between deliveries, but in the layer beneath it. The layer that held the accumulated moisture from 4 years of decomposing grain. That layer was black, the kind of black that means something biological has been at work for a long time. He had first noticed the earthworms in the fall of 2006, 2.5 years into the arrangement. He had been turning material at the edge of the pile with a long-handled fork when the tines brought up a dense cluster of them from about 8 inches down, more earthworms in a single forkful than he typically found in a square yard of his best pasture ground. He had stood there looking at them for a moment, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a man who sees a hypothesis proven. He had written 3 words in the pocket notebook. Soil remembers what you give it. Then he had gone on with his work. By 2008, the transformation was measurable to instruments, not just to eyes and hands. The pH of the border strip had moved from its native 5.4 towards something closer to 6.2. The organic matter percentage had doubled. When Leland pushed a soil probe into the strip and pulled the core, the top 8 inches came out dark and cohesive, full of structure. Nothing like the compacted red clay that still ran 10 feet to the east. He recorded all of it. He did not share it with anyone. That summer was the hottest on record in the foothills, and the heat arrived early and stayed late and pressed down on the property with a weight that exhausted both crops and people. The spent grain pile steamed more vigorously than usual in the mornings, which meant the biological activity inside it had accelerated. Leland reduced the depth of the morning scatter in the woodlot, letting the pigs work the older material from the day before more completely, before adding fresh. He was always adjusting the system in small ways that no one else would have noticed or thought to mention. Corbett was 20 that summer and working a seasonal job at a hardware store in town between semesters at State. He came out to the farm on Saturday mornings, which he had been doing since he was old enough to walk the property without supervision. And on one of those Saturdays in August, his grandfather took him to the back field and said nothing, just walked to a spot near the northeast corner where the soil ran noticeably paler than the rest and knelt down in the row stubble. Leland picked up a handful of the pale earth and held it in his palm. He closed his fist and held it for 3 seconds and then opened it. The soil crumbled immediately, breaking into dust the moment the pressure released. "Now, come here," he said. He walked Corbett to the western fence line and knelt again at the edge of the dark strip. He dug beneath the surface with 2 fingers and brought up a fistful from below the crust. He closed his fist and held it for the same count. When he opened his hand, the soil released slowly, the compressed structure breaking apart in irregular pieces that held their shape for a moment before settling. "Same amount of pressure," he said. "Different result. You want to know why?" Corbett looked at the 2 fistfuls, one in each of their hands. He was 20 and had been studying business for 2 years, and he had grown up watching his grandfather proceed, according to a logic that rarely announced itself. "Because of what you've been putting in it," Corbett said. Leland looked at the boy. It was the right answer, and the expression on the old man's face was not pride exactly, more like recognition, the look a man gives when a conversation has finally reached a point that was worth waiting for. "That's the first thing," he said. "The second is knowing how to read what the ground is telling you before you ask it to do anything. Most people ask first and read later when it's too late to matter." He stood up and brushed his palms on his pants and walked back to the barn. Corbett stayed at the fence line for a while, looking at the dark strip, turning his handful of soil over in his fingers. When he drove home that afternoon, he did not say anything to his mother about it, but he thought about it for several days afterward, which was new. Before that morning, the farm had been a place where his grandfather lived. After it, it began to seem like something else. The rhythm of those years was not dramatic. Twice a week, the truck arrived and the pile was renewed. Each morning, the gator went to the fence and came back loaded. The wood lot changed slowly beneath the feet of animals that moved through it, with the unhurried purpose of creatures whose diet gave them no reason to hurry. The herd grew by deliberate selection, Leland culling any animal that showed signs of the temperament problems that sometimes appeared in heritage lines that had been carelessly bred, keeping only the gilts that combined the body structure he wanted with the calm and maternal quality he had decided were non-negotiable. The auction prices in those years ranged between 55 and 70 cents a pound, depending on season and market conditions. It was money, and the operating costs were close enough to nothing that even the lower prices generated a modest annual return. But it was not the auction market Leland was building for, and he knew it. What he was building for had not yet announced itself. The world outside his 88 acres was changing in ways that were not yet visible from a gravel lane in the North Carolina foothills. Changes in how city people thought about food and where it came from, and what they were willing to pay for something that tasted the way pork had tasted before the industrial system decided that lean and pale and cheap was the same thing as good. He could not have named those changes precisely, But he understood land the way he understood patience, which was as a set of forces that moved in one direction, regardless of what anyone thought about them. And he had made his judgment about which direction the food world was moving and structured his operation accordingly. He did not need to be right on the timing. He needed to be right on the direction. In the winter of 2008, he was not entirely certain he had been. December of that year came in cold and stayed cold, and the woodlot was quiet, and the grain pile was low between deliveries, and the ledger showed another year of modest returns from a business that was not failing, but was not yet what it needed to be. The pig he had bought in 2003 and selected from over many subsequent years now represented a herd of 14 breeding sows and 3 boars, which was more animals than he had started with, and less than the operation could sustain if the market ever opened up the way he expected. He sat at the roll-top desk on a Thursday night in December, with the ledger open in front of him and the lamp on and the house quiet around him. He was 67 years old. The boar he had brought home from Sampson County 5 years earlier had died in November, replaced by the strongest of his grandsons. The operation was technically sound and financially marginal, and dependent for its entire input structure on an informal handshake arrangement with a brewery that was growing faster than anyone had anticipated in 2003. He could be wrong about the timing. The farm-to-table movement he believed was coming might arrive in 15 years instead of 5. It might arrive in 2 counties over and skip this one entirely. The chefs he imagined driving up his lane might turn out to prefer some other breed, some other story, some other arrangement. He had built a system based on a prediction about how the world would change, and the world was under no obligation to change on his schedule. He sat with that for a while. Then he looked back at the ledger. The numbers were what they were, and they were all accurate because he had never once fudged them, never rounded up a sale price or down a cost, never allowed himself the comfortable fiction of optimistic bookkeeping. The soil at the fence line was dark and deep and still improving. The animals were sound. The wood lot had developed a flora-ecology that would take a commercial operator 20 years and substantial capital to replicate. None of that had happened by accident. He was not wrong on the direction. He might be wrong on the timing. He turned to the last page of the year's ledger and wrote in the margin in letters slightly larger than his usual script. Could be wrong on timing, not on direction. Then he closed the book, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. He did not speak of it to anyone. He did not change anything about how he operated the following morning or any morning after that. Spring of 2010 brought the first sign that the arrangement with the brewery was not as permanent as its 5-year history had made it feel. Artisan Creek had won a silver medal at the Great American Beer Festival the previous fall, and the recognition had accelerated a distribution deal that put their beer in 3 states and required a significant expansion of production capacity. Birch Holloway came out to the farm on a Tuesday in April. Not to discuss anything in particular, he said, just to check in. He stood at the western fence line with Leland and talked about the expansion for a few minutes. And then he mentioned that the new volume was creating new decisions about the spent grain. A company out of Georgia had approached them about a processing arrangement. Nothing definite, just preliminary conversations. He wanted Leland to know that there were other options being looked at. Leland watched the tree line at the edge of the wood lot while Birch talked. When Birch finished, Leland said, "We should write something down. Just the basics. What the arrangement is, how long it's been running. What happens if either side wants to change it?" Glenn smiled and shook his head slightly. "Leland, we've been doing this for 7 years. Your daddy sold my daddy cattle. We're not going to need a piece of paper." Leland nodded. He did not push it. That evening, he opened the ledger to the current year's running notes and wrote a single line, G.W. April, No paper. His call. He had said what he had to say. The decision belonged to the other man. But he had learned enough in 69 years to understand that arrangements built entirely on trust were exactly as durable as the party's ability to remain in the room where the trust was formed, and that the people who ran companies changed, and that the trust a founder felt for his father's neighbor did not automatically transfer to whoever came next. He did not stop sleeping well because of it, but the line stayed in the ledger where he had written it, and he returned to it once or twice in the years that followed, not with bitterness, but with the specific attention he gave to any note that might become relevant later. In the fall of 2012, Corbett came home from Raleigh for a long weekend with a laptop and a folder and the energy of a 24-year-old who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. He sat down at the kitchen table with his grandfather after dinner and opened the laptop. The presentation took about 20 minutes. It was competent work, thorough in the way of someone who had done real research rather than just assembled comfortable assumptions. The farm-to-table market was growing faster than anyone had projected 5 years earlier. Heritage breed pork commanded premium prices in urban restaurants and high-end retail. The operational math was clear with 80 breeding sows, instead of the current 14 with hired labor to handle the daily feeding and management, with a modest bank loan to fund the infrastructure expansion. The operation could be generating gross revenues above $200,000 a year within 3 years. Leland listened to all of it without interrupting. He looked at each slide Corbett put up. When the presentation ended, he turned to the last page of the folder and read the projected income statement twice. "You're right about the numbers," he said. Corbett looked up. But the numbers aren't the question." Corbett set his hands flat on the table. "Then what is?" "If I borrow money from the bank today," Leland said, "I start working to pay it back. If I don't borrow money, I keep working to build. Those two things look the same from the outside. They're not the same." Corbett stared at him. "That's not how business works, Papow. You use capital to generate more capital. That's the whole model. Capital comes in different forms. I'm talking about actual capital, actual dollars. So am I." The silence in the kitchen was the particular kind that accumulates between two people who understand each other's positions clearly and have reached the end of what words can do about it. Corbett closed the laptop. He said, "I spent 4 years learning how markets work. I'm trying to help you. I know you are. But you won't listen. I listened to everything you said. You didn't agree with any of it. That's different from not listening." Corbett stood up and picked up his folder. He was not angry in the way that produces raised voices. He was angry in the way that produces cold clarity. And what he said next was very clear. "If you keep doing this your way," he said, "I'm not coming back to help you anymore." Leland watched him put on his jacket and go to the door. He did not stand up. He did not call after him. After the headlights had swept across the kitchen window and faded down the lane, he sat alone at the table for a while. Then he opened the ledger to the current week's entry and picked up his pen. His hand rested on the page for a moment before he started writing. Not long, just a moment. Then he wrote the numbers from the week and closed the book. Prentice Galt joined Artisan Creek Brewing as operations manager in the spring of 2013. He was 34 years old and had spent the previous 4 years optimizing supply chains for a textile manufacturer work that had given him a thorough education in the idea that every process contains inefficiency, and every inefficiency represents money. He drove a spotless F-150 King Ranch edition and wore Carhartt jackets that had never been near a clawhammer, and he carried a tablet computer to every meeting, including meetings that took place in farmyards. He found Leland in early summer. turning a compost pile with a pitchfork. He introduced himself and described his role and the purpose of his visit, which was to formalize what he kept referring to as the grain arrangement. He held up the tablet and showed Leland a spreadsheet. Leland wiped his hands on his overalls. "Been running fine for 10 years, he said. Don't need a contract." Galt talked about insurance liability and indemnification clauses. Leland nodded the way he nodded when he was being polite without being persuaded. "You do what you need to do," he said, and went back to his compost. The conversation was brief and, from the outside, unremarkable. But that evening, Leland took out the ledger from 2010 and found the line he had written GW April. No paper. His call. He read it twice, then opened the current year's book and added a note below the week's entries. New man, different kind of problem coming. He closed both books and put them away and did not say anything to anyone about it. In the spring of 2014, a young woman drove up the lane without calling ahead. She was in her early 30s, had come from Asheville 90 minutes away, and had heard about the farm through a conversation she could not quite trace back to a single source, which was how the best information traveled in the restaurant world. Her name was Calla Holt, and she had recently signed a lease on a space in Asheville's River Arts District, where she intended to open a restaurant built on sourced ingredients and an honest story. She did not ask Leland about feed conversion ratios or days to market, or any of the questions the commodity system used to measure an animal's worth. She asked to walk the wood lot, and he took her through it. She moved slowly, stopping to look at the condition of the root zone and the texture of the soil around the feeder areas, the things a person notices when they have been trained to connect what land produces to what shows up on a plate. She asked what the pigs ate. Leland told her simply and in order: the spent grain twice a week, the acorns from the lot, the windfall apples from the old orchard down the road, the produce market's unsellable vegetables. She stood in the middle of the lot while he talked, and her expression changed the way expressions change when a person recognizes something they have been looking for. "This is terroir," she said. "This is exactly what I want to put on my menu." She bought 2 animals on the spot, not at live auction weight, but at hanging weight after slaughter. And she offered $4.25 per pound. Corbett was there. He had driven out that morning to help with the late fall rotation, a task that required 2 people and had been his reason for calling ahead. And he was standing near the gate when Calla pulled out a checkbook and wrote the number down. He watched her hand the check to his grandfather, and he did not say anything for a moment because he was running arithmetic in his head. A 250-pound hog yielded roughly 180 pounds of hanging weight. At $4.25 per pound, that was $765 per animal. He had stood in the auction ring with his grandfather and watched the same animal sell for $175 on a good day. He had heard Amos Renfro laugh about 58 cents. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. He walked to where one of the spotted sows was working the near corner of the lot, her enormous ears down over her face, her snout pushing methodically through the leaf litter. He raised the phone and took a picture. It was the first photograph he had ever taken on this farm of his own volition, without being asked. The animal looked up at the flash and regarded him with the calm brown eyes that appeared whenever the ears were lifted, and then went back to rooting. Leland watched him take the picture. He did not comment on it. That evening, after Calla had driven back toward Asheville with arrangements in place, Corbett sat with his grandfather on the back steps as the light went down over the wood lot. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Did you know this would happen?" Corbett asked finally. "I knew this kind of person would come eventually," Leland said. "I didn't know her name." "Why didn't you go looking for her?" "Because when you go looking, you negotiate from weakness. When they come to you, you negotiate from strength." Corbett sat with that. Then he said, "Do you want help?" Leland looked at him steadily. Yes, but my way. Corbett nodded. They did not discuss the conversation from 2 years earlier, and Leland did not acknowledge that his grandson had come back, despite what he had said about not coming back. Some things did not need to be named to be understood between two people who had been paying attention. Corbett built a website that fall on a Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table. A single page with 4 photographs and a paragraph about the farm and a phone number. Nothing elaborate. Nothing that oversold what was there. Calla told a chef she knew in Charlotte. That chef mentioned it to a food writer. The phone began to ring. By the following year, Leland was selling directly to 7 restaurants. By 2015-11. In 2016, he took the last of the season's market hogs off the auction calendar entirely. Every animal went to the direct-to-restaurant channel at prices that made the auction ring look like something from a different industry. Corbett had quit his marketing job in Raleigh and come back to the farm full-time, creating a real invoice system, for the first time tracking deliveries, managing the small herd of waiting list requests from chefs who had heard from other chefs. The gross revenue that year cleared $100,000. The primary input cost remained close to zero because the trucks still came twice a week, because the handshake still held. Amos Renfro drove past the farm on a county road errand one afternoon that fall and slowed his truck almost to a stop at the western fence line. He could see the wood lot from the road if he looked. He could see the white and black animals moving in the afternoon light among the oaks. He sat there for a moment, then pulled forward and kept going. He did not call Leland. He did not stop in at the barn. But he had stopped, and that meant something, even if neither of them knew exactly what yet. Back at the brewery, Prentice Galt had spent 3 years making the operation measurably more efficient in several documented ways. He had renegotiated cardboard costs, trimmed the delivery routing, installed scheduling software that reduced overtime hours. He was good at his work, and he knew it, and the spent grain arrangement had continued to bother him, the way a single wrong note bothers a person with musical training. It was too clean. It cost nothing and had no contract, and had been running for 13 years based entirely on mutual convenience and the memory of a transaction between 2 men's fathers. In the summer of 2016, he found AgriCycle Solutions out of Georgia. A new processing technology spent grain pelletized and dried and sold as a high-protein cattle supplement to commercial feedlots. The company was looking for raw material suppliers. They offered $40 per ton. The brewery was producing 20 tons of spent grain per week by that point. The arithmetic was simple. $40 times 20 tons times 52 weeks was $41,600 per year. Found money, Galt noted in his memo to the ownership group. A fiduciary obligation to pursue. He drafted a letter to Leland Vance informing him of the change and offering him the right of first refusal at the AgriCycle price. In March of 2017, on a morning that was cold and overcast, with the smell of approaching rain, Corbett was at the kitchen window when he saw the headlights come up the lane. He recognized the truck before it reached the barn. The black F-150 King Ranch edition, still spotless, still new-looking in the way of a vehicle that had never been used for anything a truck was built to do. He set down his coffee. Leland was already outside. He had heard the tires on the gravel. Prentice Galt got out of his truck and walked toward Leland with the stride of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and felt confident about the outcome. He was not unpleasant about it. He had the manner of someone delivering information rather than delivering a verdict. The professional courtesy of a person who believes the transaction he is conducting is fundamentally straightforward. He explained the AgriCycle arrangement in the same terms he had used with the ownership group. The volume the brewery was now producing, the processing technology, the price per ton. He said that the company had been happy to help Leland over the years. Said it with the particular warmth of someone crediting themselves for a generosity they had only recently measured. He said the arrangement would conclude with the Thursday delivery, which was 2 days away. He offered the right of first refusal at $40 per ton, the same rate AgriCycle was paying, and he said it in the tone of a man who considers himself fair. Leland was holding the axe he had been using when the truck came up the lane. He set the head of it on the ground and leaned on the handle and listened to all of it without interrupting. When Galt finished, Leland looked at him with an expression that was not quite readable, not anger and not resignation, something that sat further back than either of those things. "You think you've been giving me something for free all this time," Leland said. Galt started to respond. Leland continued, "You haven't. You've been paying me. You paid me in grain and I've been investing it." Galt looked at him for a moment with the slight frown of a man trying to decide if this statement was meant literally or as some kind of rhetorical gesture. He concluded it was the latter and gave a small, sympathetic shake of his head. "Well, that's one way to look at it," he said. "But the economics have changed. I think you understand that." He paused. "The last delivery is Thursday." He said it with the finality of someone who considers the conversation concluded. He shook Leland's hand and got back in the truck and reversed down the lane. Corbett watched from the kitchen window until the truck reached the road and turned toward town. When he came outside, Leland was standing where Galt had left him, looking down the lane at the place where the truck had been. Corbett stopped beside him. "What do we do now?" Corbett said. His voice was careful. Leland turned and walked toward the equipment shed without hurrying. "We keep the books," he said. Corbett followed him. "This is not the time for keeping books, Papa." Leland stopped and turned around. His expression was the same one he had used in the woodlot years ago when he showed Corbett how to read soil by feel. The look of a man who is about to say something that will only be understood later, but needs to be said now anyway. "Keeping the books well," he said, "is what prepared us for today. You'll understand by Monday." He went into the shed and stayed there until evening. Corbett stood in the yard for a while, then went inside and made dinner for both of them. And neither of them talked about Galt during the meal. Thursday morning arrived overcast and cold. The kind of March cold that carries the memory of winter without quite belonging to it anymore. Jasper Coombs pulled the flatbed into the lane at his usual time, 7:20 in the morning, and parked at the western fence line the way he had parked there more than 1,400 times in 6 years. He climbed down from the cab and walked around the front of the truck to where Leland was already standing, and he stopped and looked at the ground for a moment before he looked up. "I'm sorry about this, Mr. Vance," he said. "It ain't right." His voice had the quality of a man who has had to do something that conflicts with his own judgment and has not found a way to make peace with it. He was 53 years old and had been driving delivery routes his whole adult life and had developed in the way of people who spend years delivering things to the same places, a kind of attachment to the destinations and the people who received what he brought. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a decent one. And decent men feel the difference between the two things. "It's not your doing," Jasper Leland said. He extended his hand and Jasper shook it, and the grip between them held for a moment longer than a routine handshake. Roy got back in the cab and engaged the hydraulics on the dump bed, and the last load of spent grain from Artisan Creek Brewing slid off the flatbed and settled into a steaming pile against the western fence line. It joined the material that was already there, the accumulated residue of the previous weeks, but something in the air around it had changed. It was no longer the beginning of something. It was the end. Roy drove out of the lane without looking back. Leland stood at the fence for a long time after the truck's sound had faded. He did not go inside immediately, and he did not go to the woodlot or the shed. He stood at the fence with one hand resting on the top rail, looking at the pile and at the dark ground around its base. The ground that had been changing since the first Monday in May of 2003, when the first truck had arrived, and a new kind of accounting had begun. Corbett came to the door of the house and saw him standing there, and understood without asking that this was not the time to interrupt. He went back inside. What Leland was doing at the fence was not grieving exactly, though there was something in it that resembled grief. It was closer to the private acknowledgement that a chapter had closed, a sustained and particular effort completed, and that what came next would be different in character, if not in direction. He had known this day would come in some form. He had built for it without knowing its specific shape. Now the shape was clear, and he stood with it the way he stood with most difficult things, which was without flinching and without rushing to be done with the feeling. When he came inside, he went directly to the small office and opened the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk and lifted out the ledgers, all 14 of them. He set them on the kitchen table in order oldest at the left, current at the right, and he sat down in front of them and looked at the row of green-covered books for a moment without opening any of them. Then he called Corbett in from the other room and said, "Get some paper and a calculator." They worked through the weekend, not continuously, but in long, unbroken stretches, the kind of working hours that happen when two people are engaged with something that holds their attention without needing to be explained. Leland read entries and Corbett recorded figures. When they needed to verify a number, they went back to the primary entries, never estimating, never rounding in either direction. The basic calculation was straightforward, but the scope of it was not. In the early years, the brewery had been producing 15 tons of spent grain per week. By the final years of the arrangement, they had been at 20. Leland had recorded the volume estimates at each delivery for 14 years, and when Corbett averaged them across the full span of the ledgers, the number was 17.5 tons per week. 17.5 tons per week times 52 weeks per year times 14 years. 12,740 tons. Corbett wrote that number on the pad and then sat back in his chair. He looked at it for a moment and then he multiplied it by 40, which was the price per ton that Galt himself had placed on the material. The price AgriCycle was paying the number that represented the brewery's own assessment of the grain's market value, $509,600. He pushed the pad across the table to Leland. Leland looked at the number. "That is what they put in," Leland said. "That is the investment." Corbett stared at the figure. Not a gift, not a convenience. An investment made by a company that did not know it was making one into a business being built by a man who understood precisely what was happening, even when no one else did. They spent 2 more hours calculating the current value of the operation itself. The breeding stock, the established relationships with the restaurant, accounts, the signed letters of intent from 3 chefs who had already requested allocations for the coming year. When they were finished, the picture was complete, and it was not the picture of a farm operation in crisis. It was the picture of a going concern with an established brand, a loyal customer base, a documented production history, and a need for capital to adapt to a change in its input structure. Leland closed the last ledger and set his hands flat on the cover. "This is a real business," Corbett said. He was not saying it as a discovery. He was saying it as a confirmation of something he had understood for a while, but now had the numbers to state without qualification. "Always was," Leland said. They had an appointment at the bank the following Tuesday morning. Mercer Finch had been the agricultural loan officer at the county bank for 22 years, long enough to have processed applications from 3 generations of farm families in the valley, and long enough to know that the ledger formats and documentation styles farmers brought him varied almost as widely as the farms themselves. He was a careful man who took seriously the responsibility of placing institutional money into biological systems that operated on timelines longer than any quarterly report. His father had known Leland Vance since elementary school, which was why they had gotten a Tuesday appointment on short notice. But family connection was not how Mercer Finch made lending decisions, and Leland knew that and did not expect otherwise. Corbett presented the case. He laid out the 14-year input history, the documented sales record from the past 3 years, the market positioning, the letters of intent from the restaurant accounts. He explained what had changed and what had not changed. He was organized and clear, and Mercer listened with the attention of a man who has learned that the quality of a presentation does not necessarily predict the quality of the underlying operation, but that disorganized presentations usually do predict disorganized operations. Mercer opened the oldest ledger. He did not flip through it quickly. He read it. He moved through the entries with the patience of someone who understands that numbers recorded honestly tell a different story than numbers assembled to make a case, and that the difference is detectable if you know where to look. He moved from the first book to the second, and then to several others, sampling years in the middle of the span and checking the internal consistency of the entries. He stopped at a page near the end of the 2008 ledger. He read the marginal note twice. Could be wrong on timing, not on direction. He looked up at Leland across the table, and then looked back at the note without saying anything about it, and turned to the next page. He spent an hour with the ledgers. When he was finished, he closed the last one and set it on top of the stack, and folded his hands on the table. "My father told me you were the most honest man he'd ever done business with," he said. He was looking at Leland. "I always thought that was something people said. I understand now what he meant by it. He approved a line of credit for $250,000. The terms were reasonable. The collateral was the property itself, which had been debt-free for more than a decade. Leland signed the paperwork without asking to take it home and read it overnight. He had read it in the office. He already knew what it said. He did not spend the money the way a person spends a windfall. He spent it the way he had built the operation in the first place, which was deliberately and in the right sequence and without any step that was larger than the one before it could support. The first purchase was a used 30-ton grain silo bought from an equipment auction in Surry County for $8,000. It needed work, and he did the work himself over 2 weeks in April. And when it was finished, it stood at the north end of the property and represented the capacity to store a meaningful quantity of dry grain against price fluctuations in the local market. The second investment was a set of contracts with 2 local grain farmers, one who grew barley on 160 acres near the river, and one who grew field corn in the bottomland to the west. Both men had been selling to commodity aggregators at prices that reflected the aggregator's convenience rather than the farmer's labor, and Leland offered them something above the commodity rate for their entire production. In doing so, he did what the brewery had done for him, which was create a relationship built on mutual necessity rather than market abstraction. The third purchase was a used grinder mixer that could process whole grain into a custom blend. Leland developed a recipe through trial and adjustment that reproduced the nutritional profile of the brewery mash as closely as the available ingredients allowed, and he ran it on the same twice-weekly schedule the brewery trucks had maintained for 14 years, because the animals' digestive systems and behavioral patterns had been calibrated to that rhythm. And he saw no reason to change what was working. His costs went up. They went up substantially compared to the near-zero input structure of the previous 14 years. But the operation had been built with such deliberate care, the customer base established so patiently, and the product quality so consistently maintained that the margin absorbed the new costs without requiring anything dramatic. He raised his prices by 5% across all accounts. Not a single chef objected. 2 of them called to ask if he needed anything else, as if the price adjustment were the least of their concerns. Back at the brewery, Prentice Galt's arithmetic was encountering the parts of the real world that spreadsheets cannot model in advance. The agricycle trucks were based 200 miles away in Georgia. in a system that runs on precise timing distance, creates fragility, and fragility produces costs that do not appear in the original calculation. The trucks were late twice in April and broke down entirely on a Monday in May, leaving 20 tons of wet spent grain sitting in the brewery's loading area through 2 days of unseasonable heat. The biological activity that Leland had spent years redirecting into a productive system resumed with complete impartiality in the brewery's parking lot. The odor reached the residential street 3 blocks away within 36 hours. By the end of the second day, the county health department had been contacted by multiple households. An inspector visited. A citation was issued. The brewery invested $15,000 in a sealed containment unit to hold the grain between scheduled pickups. In July, AgriCycle cited softening demand in the cattle supplement market and invoked a renegotiation clause in their contract. The price dropped from $40 per ton to $25. Galt's projected $41,600 per year was now at best $26,000 minus the amortized cost of the containment unit, minus the administrative time consumed by citations and inspections and renegotiations that the previous arrangement had never required. Galt prepared a memo for the ownership group that explained the variance between projection and outcome in terms of market conditions and supplier reliability. The memo did not mention Leland Vance, whose farm was 4 miles down the road and whose western fence line had solved the identical problem for 14 years at a cost of 0 and a complaint count of none. The irony was not lost on the people in the county who had watched both operations long enough to understand what had happened. It was not discussed loudly. It was the kind of irony that people note privately and carry in their understanding of how certain kinds of intelligence work and how certain kinds do not. By the summer of 2017, Leland's restaurant accounts had grown to 16. Corbett had built a proper fulfillment system, standardized the invoice process, and established a protocol for the waiting list that gave priority to accounts with longer histories rather than those offering the highest prices. The operation was not the largest heritage pork producer in the state. It was by most measures that Leland considered relevant the best run. It was in July that Amos Renfro stopped at the co-op outside town and found Corbett loading supplies into the farm truck. He approached without urgency and without the broad ease he had carried in the years when he had considered himself well-positioned to comment on other people's agricultural decisions. "Heard your operation's doing well," he said. Corbett looked at him. Renfro was in his mid-70s now, and the years had done to him what years do to men who have spent them outdoors, which was to make them more concentrated, more visible in their actual character. "We're getting along," Corbett said. Renfro was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That breed you run, Gloucester Old Spot. You know where a man could get his hands on some?" There was no apology in the question. There was no reference to a sale ring in November of 2004, or to laughter that had carried across a crowd. But there did not need to be. Corbett had been taught by a man who believed that evidence was more important than acknowledgement, and the fact that Amos Renfro was standing at a co-op parking lot asking about heritage breed pigs was evidence enough. "Let me ask my grandfather," Corbett said. He did ask that evening. Leland was in the equipment shed, and Corbett stood in the doorway and told him what Renfro had asked. Leland listened and then was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something amused him without quite deserving a smile. "Tell him we can set aside a pair of gilts from the fall litter," Leland said. "Have him come out and look at them when they're weaned." The following August, Corbett sat at the kitchen table and closed the accounts for the first full operating year without the brewery grain. He had been doing the arithmetic in segments throughout the season, checking and rechecking his figures, and he had a reasonable sense of where the number would land. But the final figure arrived at after all the adjustments and all the processing costs and all the fuel and all the invoices from the small family-owned abattoir they used still sat on the screen in a way that required him to look at it twice before he picked up the phone. He called Leland's cell. His grandfather answered from the woodlot, where he went every morning at a time that had not changed in 14 years. $187,450, Corbett said. There was silence on the line. Not the silence of someone waiting for context, but the silence of someone who has received the number they needed and is taking a moment with it. That's the number, Corbett said. Net after everything. First full year without the free grain. Leland said nothing for a moment longer. Then he said, yes. You knew it would be something like this. I didn't know the number, Leland said. I knew the direction. Corbett held the phone and looked at the figure on the screen. $187,450. The most profitable year in the 128-year history of a farm that had been purchased for $1,100 in 1889. Earned in the first year the operation had been required to stand entirely on what Leland had built. Without the gift, it had never actually been. He heard his grandfather's voice again, quieter. The value was never in the grain, Leland said. The value was in what was done with it. Then the line was quiet, and Corbett understood his grandfather had set the phone down and was standing somewhere on the property that mattered to him, looking at something that could not be seen from town. Wilda came to the farm the following week on a Saturday, which she had been doing all her life and would continue to do for as long as she was able. She found her father and her son at the shed, running a test batch through the grinder mixer, checking the consistency of the new feed blend against the records from the previous season. She watched them work for a while from the door of the shed before either of them noticed her. When Leland looked up and saw her standing there, she asked the question she had been carrying since Corbett had called her with the number. Did you know it would turn out like this? Leland stopped the grinder and looked at his daughter. He had last heard that question from his grandson, and before that in a different form from herself at a kitchen table in December of 2003. He had never answered it the same way twice, because the question had not been the same each time, and the answer had changed accordingly. I knew the land doesn't lie, he said. Everything else is patience. Wilda looked at him for a long time. She was 54 years old and had spent most of those years carrying a private worry about the particular way her father's mind worked. The slowness and the certainty of it. The refusal to be persuaded by anything that could not be demonstrated in the soil or in the ledger. She had not been wrong to worry. She had also, she understood now, not been entirely right about what she was worrying about. She walked into the shed and picked up one of the morning's feed samples and looked at it in her palm, the way Corbett had seen his grandfather look at soil years ago, not yet knowing how to read it, but beginning to understand that reading it was possible. In 2019, Artisan Creek Brewing was sold to a beverage conglomerate headquartered in St. Louis. The transaction was announced in a press release that emphasized the brewery's award-winning heritage and the conglomerate's commitment to preserving its character. Birch Holloway and his co-founder took their money and left the industry. Prentice Galt was transferred to a regional logistics hub in Cleveland to manage a portfolio of beverage brands. The beer people said when they talked about it, it all tasted the same from the outside and different from the inside, which is what happens when the people who cared about it most are no longer in the room. The Vance farm did not notice the change. Leland Vance died in the winter of 2021 on the farm where he had been born 80 years earlier. He had been slowing for 2 years in the way that deliberate men slow not suddenly, but by degrees, doing less each day, while losing nothing of the particularity with which he did what remained. Corbett was with him at the end, and Wilda and the farm was quiet in the way farms are quiet in February, which is like no other silence. In the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk, below the 14 ledgers and below the current year's book, and below a folder of signed restaurant contracts, Corbett found a folded piece of paper without a date. The handwriting was his grandfather's in the small, careful script that had filled 40 years of record-keeping. It said only this: the land doesn't lie. Everything else is patience thing. There was no indication of when it had been written. Corbett read it twice and folded it back along its original creases and put it in his shirt pocket. He runs the farm now. The herd stands at 60 breeding sows. The waiting list for their product extends 2 years forward. He keeps the ledgers the way his grandfather kept them, in the same green-covered format, with the same daily discipline of recording what actually happened, rather than what he hoped for. And he keeps a digital copy of each year's entries on a laptop he charges in the kitchen every night. Amos Renfro's pair of gilts from the fall litter have grown into a small operation on the back 40 of the Renfro property. He has not replicated what the Vance farm took 20 years to build, and he knows it, and he does not pretend otherwise. But he shows up at the regional livestock meeting each year and sits in the back row and listens to the conversations about heritage, genetics, and premium markets. And when younger farmers ask him what he knows about the Vance operation, he tells them what he observed from across a fence line, and what it took him longer than it should have to understand. The quarter-acre strip at the western fence line no longer receives anything from outside the property. The last material from Artisan Creek Brewing has long since completed its transformation, and the pile that was a permanent feature of the landscape for 14 years is gone, absorbed into the earth that it altered. What remains is a band of soil that runs darker and deeper than anything else on the property visible from the lane. If you know to look for it, the kind of black that means something biological has been working patiently for a very long time. Before he died, Leland planted American chestnut trees in that strip, 40 of them in 2 rows set 18 feet apart, according to the recommended spacing for a grove that expects to be standing in 100 years. The American chestnut is a slow-growing tree, slower even than the Gloucestershire Old Spot is a slow-growing pig, and the ones Leland planted will not produce significant mast for 15 or 20 years, and will not reach full canopy for longer than that. And the man who planted them knew all of this without needing to calculate it. They stand there now in the strip of black earth. 40 young trees with the particular gray-brown bark of early growth, not yet tall enough to cast real shade, but rooted in ground that will hold them through anything the North Carolina foothills can produce. Corbett walks past them most mornings on his way to the woodlot, and does not always stop, but sometimes he does. The story of Leland Vance and the brewery grain is not a story about getting something for nothing. It is a story about 2 entirely different ways of seeing what something is worth and what it takes to know the difference. One way of seeing is fast and legible and comfortable with the kind of number that fits on a spreadsheet. The other way is slow and hard to explain and requires a pocket notebook and a willingness to stand at a fence line and look at a pile of waste for 3 months before deciding what it is. The truest value was never in the grain. It was in the vision of the man who understood what to do with it, and the patience to let what he knew become what he could prove. The work was the asset. Everything else was just a temporary input.